Hi, and welcome to Rethink Dialogue. In today's episode, we're going to sit down with Shane Steele, former marketer from Twitter, Coca-Cola, and Yahoo. She has some pretty interesting stuff to share with us. Let's have a talk with her. Hi, Shane.
Hello.
Really a pleasure to meet you. I remember when I saw you back at PivotCon in 2012. I was like, wow, that girl, I got to talk to her and I have to invite her to Rethink. And now finally you're here. So it's a pleasure.
Well, I'm glad you reached out. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I am currently a marketing consultant. I live in San Francisco, and I'm working with a number of early stage companies, helping them with strategy and marketing. Previously, I was working at Twitter, where I led the marketing team on the advertising side of the business.
Yeah.
And before that, I have a long career in marketing with kind of an emphasis on digital. I worked at Yahoo prior to Twitter. I've also worked on the brand side at Coca-Cola, where I was involved in the digital marketing for the North America brands.
Okay, cool. Wow. That's marketing all over.
Yes, and I've also been on the agency side as well.
Really?
Yep.
Which agency?
I was at Sapient,
right.
and then a small agency in Atlanta for a couple of years.
Okay. And you're from San Francisco, or you're from?
No, I've been in San Francisco for about 2.5 years now.
Okay.
East Coaster originally, was born in Connecticut, or Massachusetts, and lived in Connecticut.
Okay.
And but love California. It's definitely my home away from all my family, which is back on the East Coast.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So how would you define the future of marketing? It's a huge one. I know.
I would say, like, the biggest thing that I'm seeing now is this idea of like a mashup and sort of the convergence of all these different forms of media that are coming together, and it's creating a lot of complexity and confusion. I think we're kind of at this point in time right now where the dust hasn't really settled, and it's just changing so much. It's changing so much in terms of what media looks like, where you have professional publisher content, you have user-generated content, and then you have brand content. And what's happening is that it's all coming together.
Yeah.
And it's coming together because of a number of reasons that I'm going to talk about tomorrow.
Yeah.
But you see it in both the traditional media companies in terms of how they're evolving their platforms, and there's a bunch of debate over whether or not these companies are media companies or platform companies. If you look at companies like BuzzFeed, or look at places like where I was at Twitter or Facebook, where you have literally an environment where you're bringing together content from those three entities, right? You're connecting with people that are sort of tweeting on their own behalf. You have brands that are tweeting on their behalf, and then you have media companies using it for a way to extend the content that they're creating professionally. And it's all professional, right? It's all blending over. I wrote a blog post yesterday.
Exactly.
All the speakers here are writing blog posts, so like everybody is a publisher now.
Yeah.
Right? That's sort of the common theme. So how people consume all that content, how they digest it, how they organize it. We're still kind of figuring that all out.
Exactly.
And there's a million different ways to do it.
And it kind of also makes the boundaries between what's editorial and what's really
exactly
what type of content are we really consuming here.
Exactly.
Which brings us over to native advertising.
Right. Right, which is another thing that I'm talking about.
Because I've asked almost all my speakers previously about native advertising, and everyone has a different definition of it.
Sure.
Yeah. So what's your take on native advertising?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different definitions depending on like which platform it's on and in which environment, but I think it's kind of like just the new buzzword for something that's always existed. If you look at like print advertising and the kind of ads you see in fashion magazines, to me that's native advertising, and that's some of the best native advertising out there, because people buy those magazines as much for the ads as they do for the content. Like the majority of the content in a lot of those is ads, and that's what people want. And it works really well in that environment because it's the kind of content that makes sense based on the mindset and it's the context that it's in that makes sense. And what's happening in the digital space now is, the banner ad was invented, I don't know, like how many years ago now?
90 something.
And it wasn't particularly native, right? That idea of a rectangular square box next to, other kinds of content. it didn't sort of weave seamlessly in the same way that you get like the Gucci ad in the Vogue magazine.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened is that publishers are starting to learn from these other platforms where everything is woven kind of seamlessly. You know, if you look at the timeline in your Facebook feed or your timeline in your Twitter feed, it's all woven together, and all the content is very similar. So I think it's a combination of the content and the format being more seamless with the context and the environment in which it is.
Right, like that. So content marketing is something that everyone is talking about at this moment. There's a lot of brands that are engaging in creating a lot of content, like Red Bull. You have others as well. So can everyone succeed when it comes to content marketing?
I think they can, but I think it's hard. I think it's a discipline that requires real skill sets. I think that's why brands have relied on agencies to help them with content. But I think of content with like a capital C. So it's not just about a blog or the content that you might put on your website, or even the ads that you're creating for your paid campaign. I mean, content is much broader than that. Now, especially because of these platforms that allow for so many different forms of communication. Your employees can become content, and all the actions that you take as a company sort of become content, because people are going to react to those things and create content to help spread the story of the brand. So I think the definition of content has really gotten much broader, and I think brands need to really think about this idea of converged media, or the paid, owned, and earned aspects of content when thinking about a content strategy. But certainly, it all starts with owned content, right? It all starts with what you as a company are creating that you can put out to the world, whether it's through an owned channel like your website, or platforms for sharing, or paid media vehicles. And it is a really important skill set, and it can be challenging to create really great content. That's why, going back to native advertising, a lot of brands now, instead of just relying on agencies or maybe in-house folks, they're working directly with the media companies to create content. And that's nothing new. What's new is now that it's looking a lot more like the editorial content. Right. So you have I was just reading an article in VentureBeat yesterday. It was about the Internet of Things. And I click into the article, and it was written by VentureBeat staff, but in collaboration with Ford. And it was an article about how technology and internet technology is being applied to auto manufacturing. Right. So an example of content that was presented to me from a publisher, but you go into it, and it's really something that they've worked with Ford to create. So I think that's one of the other important distinctions, I think, in how people are talking about native advertising today, is who's creating that content. Is it coming from the publisher, and then how is that different? How is that distinguished on the website?
And how do you think the consumer will react to that? Do you think they notice any difference? Do you think they feel differently about the brands, or will they feel stronger, or will they be more like, oh my God, it's more advertising in that space as well?
I think it depends on how good the content is, and I think it's also important to make it clear when it's paid for content, where it's coming from the perspective of the brand versus the perspective of the media company and the publisher, because media companies are brands too, and they need to really think about what do they represent, what is their point of view, the content that is coming from the point of view and the perspective of the publisher, and differentiating that from the brand. And I think it just depends on how well that line can be walked. I think it potentially can have an impact on these media brands.
I know that tomorrow Gary Vaynerchuk is coming on Skype, and he's all about context. So it's like content is king and marketing is queen and everything is cool, but context is the most important thing.
That's great.
I kind of I understand why he's saying it, and what's your take on the contextual?
I mean, context is everything, because it all comes down to relevance. So I think, and you need to think about it in terms of multiple facets of context. So it's who are you talking to, what environment are you talking to them in, what are they doing when they're there, what's their mindset, what are they trying to accomplish. by interacting with you, or what are they trying to accomplish in their lives at that point of time? Like, where physically are they? So the more of that data that becomes available, I think the more marketers will be able to take that into account from a contextual targeting perspective.
Yeah.
And so you can't really think about content without that context, because you won't have relevance. You could have more relevance the more you know about that context.
Yeah. So actually, that's the one that is connecting the content and context is the big data. Everyone is talking about big data.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of companies, it's like, yeah, we heard about this big data, but what is it? What can we use it for?
Yeah.
And I mean, it actually is the connector between content
Right.
and context.
Right.
So in your keynote, you're also going to be talking about cultural jacking.
Yeah.
Which it's a cool concept. We've seen some brilliant examples in the past year, I would say.
Yeah. I think this has sort of been like the year of, real-time marketing coming into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And again, it's being driven by the fact that information is moving so much more quickly. It's why the media companies are having to work that much more quickly to get news out, because consumers are breaking the news, right? We're all publishers, so everything's moving faster. Consumer expectations are to find out about things faster, and it's an opportunity for brands to insert themselves in these conversations as they start to explode. When big events happen. People turn to the internet to get that information in real time, and since that's where the eyeballs are going, that's where brands need to go too. So the way that we've seen some marketers get really successful at that is to insert themselves into that conversation, or like hijack the conversation around the news as it's unfolding, which is a challenge, right? Because traditionally marketing has been something that you plan well in advance, right? It's very campaign based. You have flight dates, you have a whole project plan and then a launch plan around it. And now it's much more about being agile if you want to be a part of these conversations as they're unfolding. And so like, the one brand that gets mentioned all the time is Oreo, because they had that really famous post that they did during the Super Bowl when there was a blackout, and they posted, you can still dunk in the dark, and it got like so many retweets on Twitter and tons of likes on Facebook, and it was the thing that got written up. It was sort of this like moment in time when everyone sort of got it, I think. But what was interesting is that it was part of a broader campaign focused on this idea of culturejacking. And in fact, it won, I think, the top award at the Cannes Lions. And what they did, very successfully was weave Oreo into the daily conversation. It was called the Daily Twist campaign. So they had a virtual newsroom that they created where they would basically look at what's happening in the world and in culture on a daily basis and try to talk about Oreo through the lens of that in a way that was relevant and clever and really simplified. I think back to context, one of the most important things is like how people are consuming content is much shorter bursts of information. And so the idea of text and the length of text versus photos, all of that is just as important in context. And one thing they did really well is they produced these images that used the cookie, and it was really simple but very clever. And they had a number of them that, not only did they get engagement, they got tons of PR out of the campaign, and it served the goal of the brand and sort of moved their story forward, which is all about making the brand relevant and these, kind of moments of happiness tied into the daily conversation. But there's lots of examples of brands that are doing the same thing and really working towards trying to have more of an agile approach to marketing. And I think one of the keys that may not seem obvious in terms of how to do this well is that you can plan so much of it in advance. Because, and if you look back at the Oreo campaign, a lot of what they did was tied to milestones and anniversaries or holidays and things like that you could plan well in advance. And I think the same is true for any marketer that wants to do this idea of culturejacking. You can really plan a lot of that advance when putting together a content calendar or thinking about what that whole editorial calendar is going to look like for the year.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. So it requires planning, and it requires an idea and a strategy. So just be nimble enough to act when things are happening. Exactly. At the moment. So
not every brand, like especially smaller businesses, they're not going to have a staff and a agency roster to be able to put together a virtual newsroom. So I think it comes down to having that plan, sort of knowing what you want to do in advance, identifying those things that are going to happen that you know in advance that are part of real-time culture. But then also identifying, where there might be some really interesting moments where there's, potentially some uncertain outcomes. So there might be, some on-the-fly work that needs to be done, and make some bets around those. And sort of identify we're going to invest some resources around, this. Something that's happening in our industry, right? And we're going to do some real, focused real-time efforts around that, because we know that's when a lot of people are going to be tuning in that care about our product, that care about the segment that we're in. Yeah.
So if you go to the company side, so which type of advice would you give to a company today when it comes to what they should focus on when it comes to marketing? Because to give a little bit of context to the Norwegian market, there's a lot of companies that are kind of like lost. They have this traditional marketing plan, and then there's this social media thing that is on the side, and then they have, we have to think about digital, but digital, what is it? Is it online banners? What should we do? So how should they any advice you would give them in terms of marketing in the digital age that we are in the middle of?
Yeah, I mean, hearing that, I think it's still the same thing in the U.S., which is the integration piece, right? That, like, I started talking about convergence, and I think in order to take advantage of all of that, you really need to integrate all of those different, potentially siloed areas of marketing, whether it's PR, whether it's, the folks that are responsible for owned media, paid media, social, bringing them together to develop an integrated plan to understand how every aspect of marketing that you're doing can be integrated across all of those channels. So thinking about your own content first, thinking about how you can amplify that through paid content, depending on who your audience is, and then looking for those ways that you can activate communities to share that content. And sometimes that's through paid advertising, right? It's being able to reach people that maybe aren't following you, but doing it in a way that's going to get people talking. That's where tying into culture can really help, because it's relevant. There's sort of a social currency when you're really of the moment and sharing some information that's real time. So it's being able to create content and stories that other people are going to want to talk about, and getting those teams together to think about how you can optimize the content and then optimize the distribution of that content to really activate it.
Yeah, good. Any books or what inspires you? Where do you get that little spark?
Well, I read a lot. I read a lot of news on the industry, but there's one book I actually read recently that I really enjoyed, which was it's called True Story, and it's written by a guy named Tyne Montague, who's been in the ad business for a while, and he has an agency called Co-Collective. And his idea is that that it's not so much about traditional storytelling anymore. It's really about this thing he calls story doing, which is kind of going back to what I was saying about the big C of content, that it's not just about like the ads that you're creating or any of the things that are traditional storytelling. It's all the things that you as a company do, and how do you make sure that that's visible to the outside world. So his idea is that companies that are really acting in ways that tell a broader meta story about what they stand for and what they believe in are more likely to be talked about, and they're more effective in their marketing because they're relying less on the paid advertising than on getting other people to talk about what they're doing. Some really great examples in the book.
Yeah, thank you. Well, okay. Thank you for coming to Rethink Dialogue, and thank you for coming to Rethink as well.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.